Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tambling, and I work with the Center for Congregational Health, and I direct the Intentional Interim Ministry program there. And wanted to have you here today to explore some of the issues that churches are dealing with as they enter times of transitions between pastors. I think one of the reasons that it's critical to do something like this right now is that we're experiencing what you might call the great migration of ministers. I think as the pandemic ends, there are a lot of people that are just tired. And they're ready to move on. And I think there have been a lot of really good souls that stayed through the pandemic just to make sure that the congregation was in order, and then it's time for them to leave. So today we are really fortunate to have two experts in the field. We have Marvin Morgan and Layne Smith. They both got a tremendous amount of experience working with churches during periods of transition as intentional interim ministers. And they both also lead training for future intentional interim ministers with a wealth of information. But welcome to both of you. Really glad to be here.
Thank you.
So one of the things I'd love for us to do is just have you introduce yourself a little bit. Tell us who you are, how long you've done this, how did you feel called to it? Just give us a little background if you don't mind.
Marvin?
Thank you. Well, I am Marvin rather than Layne. And it is a blessing to be here. I was called to a senior pastor position at the age of 21, a UCC congregation in North Carolina, and have served as a full-time or part-time pastor for 53 years. I've served 3 UCC congregations, 2 chaplaincy positions, spent 16 years as senior administrator and adjunct faculty at a theological seminary, ITC, in Atlanta, Georgia, and have been blessed for the past 14 years to serve as an intentional interim minister. Thank you.
That's amazing. Absolutely amazing. Layne, you get to follow that one up.
All right, Layne Smith. I'm just a baby compared to Marvin. I've only been ordained 42 years. I have served a couple of churches as an associate, and then served one church as the installed pastor for 15 plus years, and then the next one for 11 plus years. In 2009, I began my journey as an intentional interim minister, and it really has been a journey. I've gotten to live in some wonderful places: Charlotte, North Carolina; Raleigh, North Carolina; Richmond, Virginia; Tysons Corner, Virginia; Dallas, Texas. And I led a church also in Oklahoma City through the process, even though I didn't move there physically. For 4 of those years, I was an employee of the center, and I currently do facilitate the field work for those who've been through the training, but the practical side of it, I facilitate that now. So that's a little about me.
That's fantastic. And I have to put in a plug for Layne. He does an amazing job working with our new trainees in field work and getting them started in the field. So very lucky to have both of you here. But okay, so let's start. Imagine that a church calls you and says, I'd like to talk to you about what's happened in our church. We have our senior pastor's leaving. He's been here for a long time. We don't know where to start. What do we do? When you walk in that first time, what do you find? What issues are there? The feelings are there? What have you experienced?
Well, as has been indicated in many of the materials that we have read, I think specifically of Managing Transitions by William and Susan Bridges. And of course, the wonderful training that we received with Les Robinson. What we normally encounter initially is an extremely high level of anxiety. I think Les likes to say that the anxiety level is so high that people's brains appear not to function clearly. Well, the anxiety is understandable. The congregation perhaps might be in a period of crisis, but a healthy congregation may suddenly discover that the pastor is ready to retire. And there is a bit of panic. People want to know, oh my. And the questions indicate as much. What are we going to do about finding a pastor? We must find a pastor to replace Pastor Andy. Well, and it is quite clear that there's anxiety about finding the next settled pastor. We're in a position, of course, to help direct that conversation, and we'll speak on that later.
Well, our churches typically ask some of the same questions our children did when we got ready to go out for the evening. Where are you going? Can we go too? Who's going to stay with us? And so that's a picture of the anxiety. Sometimes there's deep division. The pastor didn't leave on a happy note. And so there are those kinds of issues. I look at the building. Is the building way oversized for the size of the congregation? That could indicate that they, at one point, were much larger, and now they're much smaller, but they may still have the same bureaucracy, the same structure that they did when, and tried to do the same ministries when they were 2 or 3 times the size they are now. So those are the kinds of things that I look for when I talk with a congregation, and the questions that I ask when I talk with a congregation who's just lost their pastor.
That makes so much sense. Isn't it funny when you walk into a place? I think we all have a perception of who we are that may or may not be the same way that other people perceive us. And it just sort of happens that way with churches too. I love the analogy of a child. That's a great one. All right, so for those people that are not tremendously familiar with the interim process, or what we've been calling intentional interim ministry, can you give me some ideas of what some of the options are for an interim period, intentional interims or otherwise?
Well, Les says the difference between a traditional interim, typically, and an intentional interim ministry is the difference between marking time and investing time. Are we just going to mark time until we get a newly installed pastor? Or are we going to invest this time in learning about ourselves, making sure we're clear about our mission, our structures, any things that we need to let go of from the past? And that's investing. That's doing good work during the in-between time. And I think the real benefit of this, the goal is that congregation will be very clear then about the kind of pastor that they need. The worst thing to do is we want somebody just like the last one, or we want somebody that's totally different from the last one, and neither one of those is the place to go.
Right.
And if I may add, Layne, because of our wonderful ecumenical relations, there are some differences in the terminology that we use from one denomination to the next. There are terms available to us such as a bridge pastor. A person might serve as a supply pastor. And as Layne has indicated, marking time. That intentional interim minister tends to be a person who has been trained in intentional interim ministry. That is to say, they have studied what a congregation might need to do, and they have studied the role of the interim pastor. And we always eventually get around to mentioning the 5 focus points of interim ministry. A trained intentional interim minister will help a congregation to look at its heritage, to look at its mission, to look at its leadership structure, as Layne has already alluded to look at its connections within the community and within denominations, and of course, to address its future. And it is the role that an intentional interim pastor plays is one of helping to nurture the congregation, develop a healthy sense of itself, separate and apart from any called pastor.
Yeah, and one of the struggles that I've historically encountered is to be clear about what mission is. There is mission, and then there are missions. Mission is, why do you exist? What would be different in the kingdom of God if your community of faith went away tomorrow? What difference? What is God's unique call on your life? Now, it will involve missions, but mission is important. The whole of intentional interministry revolves around getting clear about mission. If you're clear about the mission to which God has called you, then you can put together a leadership group or leadership structure that will help you live out that mission. And when you get to connections, it will help you know who you need to be connected with, as Marvin said, denominationally and community worldwide, as far as that goes, to live out your mission. And then the future is, okay, we're ready to really get serious about looking for an installed pastor. And what kind of pastor do we need to lead us to live out that mission? So it's all an organic piece that is important. And it is utterly flexible. You go into a situation, these are areas that healthy churches and churches that want to be healthy need to address from time to time. But it's absolutely individualized to the congregation because you have a transition team that decides how you will address these folks.
Thanks, Layne, for mentioning that all important transition team. I think surely no trained interim would make the mistake of assuming that they should guide the congregation through those 5 focus points. It is the help of that transition team that enables the expertise, enables the learning that occurs during this important interim time to remain present with the congregation when the interim moves on to another location. That is an excellent reference that you've made there, Layne. And there's some denominational differences that impact our work to some extent. If you are in a connectional church, whether it's a bishop might appoint an interim and give that interim a certain mandate that really has to be fulfilled because that's why you've been appointed. Our hope is that such appointed persons may also eventually be trained so that in addition to fulfilling the mandate that the bishop or the presiding elder might give to them, they will also feel free enough to address the 5 focus points. And I guess at some point in our conversation, we'll be able to break those down a bit.
Well, and the importance to me of someone from the outside, if you will, is that person, that interim, can ask the difficult questions, the awkward questions, and can help channel the banks, so to speak, of the conversations. The options for a church are, if let's say they have a significant staff that can do the pastoral care and administrative things, they may just want to get a supply preacher. Or perhaps get an interim pastor, and that could be full-time, part-time, however they want to work it. And then there's the intentional interim minister that serves as the full pastor, but also facilitates the process. There's another option that, let's say, if the bishop has appointed an interim who doesn't have the training to lead a process like we're talking about is to engage a transition facilitator. Transition facilitator, and I did that in Oklahoma City. I would go there. I trained. We had a retreat for the transition team, and we planned the first congregational event. I came back a month later and facilitated, and the transition team led that congregational event. I stayed over, we evaluated it, decided how we'd report to the church, and planned the next month. And so once a month, I would come for several months to help them go through the process, but they had a staff and they had a supply preacher. So there's several ways you can do the process and several options.
I think it's wonderful that there's so many options right now, because I think a lot of times, if you think about the process, if it's going to take 12 to 18 months as an example, you might be fortunate enough to find someone that's willing to move to Montana, to Alaska, to wherever you are, but you might not be able to. And I think we've got so many great capabilities with Zoom, but it's nice to be able to pull someone in just part-time as the church needs it. And I guess the other thing that I heard you say that just really stuck out to me was the fact that it is so flexible. Wouldn't it be easy if we had a checklist and we just went down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we do all those things? Yep, we've accomplished everything we're going to do, and now the new person's coming in. But the work feels really interactive, and I love the way that you both expressed that.
And every congregation really is different. I mean, we tend to refer to the focus points as if it is a template that would fit everywhere. But I've been in some congregations as an interim where they were quite well connected to the adjudicatory, well connected to ministerial alliances in the community to maximize their impact. And so that congregation was able to virtually skip the connections focus point and move on to some others that tend to take more time. I have been surprised over the years, and I don't know if Layne has faced this, when you go into a church that has not looked at or discussed its mission with the capital M in 50 years, under the assumption that whatever brought the church together, whatever that purpose was, that it would still be sufficient 50 years later. And it's been very interesting and quite a growth experience for congregations to first realize they have not dealt with that mission statement, and also to go on and address it in some very significant ways. It's one of the meaningful ways of engaging members of the congregation in the process.
In my first interim, the pastor left quickly. He wasn't forced out, but it wasn't a happy leaving. And the church had just spent 18 months with Dave Odom, who at that time was the director, or executive director, I forget what he's called, of the Center for Congregational Health. And they had restructured the whole church. Deacons, administrators, everything was restructured. They had had all these conversations around the table. Typically things that we do when we go in, get the congregation together, and then report out each table and try to find some common areas. And they said, now, if we're asked to sit down at a table again, we're not going to do this. Well, you talk about having to be flexible, about having to work to figure out. And I kept the road between the church and Les Robinson hot, with him helping me figure out how to do this and not having one of the major tools that we use. So yeah, everything is real flexible.
Yes.
So how'd you end up solving it? I'm curious.
Well, we did one survey. but I'm not a big fan of surveys because surveys, people don't get the benefit of hearing other voices. This is where I stand, you know, but if I have to hear what somebody else thinks, then I may be willing to rethink my own position, or I have some new information that I didn't have. Well, so we did some going to Bible study, Sunday school classes, and have those conversations in some of the groups that already, the senior adult group. So we didn't have around the table, but we had virtually around the table because we used the groups that already existed. And then one of the things during the intentional interim is that you need to do things in prime time when most people show up. And for a lot of churches, they're Sunday churches now. So if you're going to do something, you need to do it either during the Bible study hour, if you have that before worship, or have a lunch and do something after worship. Otherwise, you may not have very good attendance.
Allow me to mention one additional way of addressing the fact that people are very busy and not a lot of time is available to the church midweek. We have used surveys quite heavily, but once getting the responses to the surveys, those responses are correlated and placed in categories so that all of the responses are still there, and they're summarized. Then, and we just happen to refer to those as Sankofa, Sankofa surveys. The Sankofa symbol, you may recall, is that most frequently is that of a bird that is flying forward with its head reaching toward its back. But it's not simply looking back. It is retrieving an egg from its back and bringing the egg toward the front. The implication is that that new generation is going to be taught the most important and most significant aspects of the past. So after sending out the surveys, we will have what we call Sankofa dialogues. We will schedule one at 8 o'clock on a Monday morning. This is by Zoom, incidentally. Schedule another one at midday. In a retirement congregation such as the one I'm in now, we can have a midday meeting and 100% of those who are expected to attend will be there. And then we will of course schedule a Sankofa dialogue to talk about the content of the survey at 7 p.m. And we do that all within about 1 week period of time. That is one way to address the fact that we're serving some very, very busy people. Even retirees are busy.
Yeah, and I do think it's critical. If you have a congregational conversation around any of these focus points, that my goal for the transition team has always been within 2 weeks of that event,
yes,
you get back to the congregation and say, this is what we heard. Did we get it right? And if you do that for the first focus point, then the congregation will say, well, they really are listening to us. Yes. It's worth my effort to come back and do this again. But if they don't get feedback, it'll be that, well, we don't know what they're doing. We don't have any idea. And so that raises a suspicion. So as transparent, as early and as transparent as you can be, these are the main things. Now, there were some outliers, and here are the outliers, but the vast majority came out here. And the congregation appreciates that kind of feedback.
Absolutely. I know I've been part of churches in the past where the search committee comes together behind locked doors in secret, and our imaginations can go wild when we don't know what's going on. And The term that comes to mind is one that we use around the center a lot. We're radically congregational. And there's something wonderful about both of you coming in, and you're experts in what you're doing, but you're not coming in as an expert. You're working with everybody. And I really like the way that you do that.
Well, Les has always said that we are process experts. We're experts on the process.
Right.
But we don't come in and say, here's what you need to do, and print it up, and it ends up being on a shelf gathering dust. Those kinds of prescriptive experts.
If time permits, this one response, Layne, to a comment that you made to the situation that you entered.
Yeah.
There was one gentleman who said to me, had a very strong voice, said, "Pastor, we answered all of those questions about 10 years ago. They ought to be in one of those files somewhere right at the church office." That is exactly what that gentleman said to me. I won't say which year, because that would sort of place the church, but that was the understanding, that if they had dealt with any of these questions 10 years ago, then there was no need to go through that again. So we have a lot of educating to do when we go in as interim clergy, not to push our own agenda, but to clearly discern. We refer to it as settling in. When you're settling in to listen to people's stories, those stories will reveal so much about the life of a congregation. And we just may discover that some of the key leaders in the congregation are not necessarily the folk who are currently holding leadership positions. That key leader might be off to the side, a person that everyone consults with, or frequently consult with, and that person may be more the leader of that congregation than anyone who has been elected. Systems theory has helped us a great deal. I know I have grown as a result of studying that. And I like that image of 3 to 5 people standing within something that looks like a hula hoop, but it is elastic. And there's tension in that group, sufficient tension to keep the elastic belt around them. But each time one person moves, unless someone else moves, the process falls apart. The same is so true for the church. What happens in one part of the system has some impact upon what happens in other parts of that system. Talking about that with local churches sometimes is like opening a book before them, because they have tended not to think of it in that way. Some of our congregations are highly, we use the term siloed. One group doing excellent work within their silo. Another group might be doing marginal work within their silo, but people never interact across those silos to know what the others are doing. It is exciting work, and to say the least, interim ministry is an exciting place to serve and to sense one's call.
Yeah, in responding to what Marvin said, I went to the doctor 10 years ago and got a good report. So I don't need to go back. I'm still good. And you hear that and you say, well, that's just crazy.
Yep.
Well, there you go.
Mm-hmm. That's a great example. I think I'm going to steal that from you and use it from now on. I'll give you credit for it, of course, though.
I've never had an original thought in my life. It's always, I learned it from somebody else.
Haven't we all? Without a doubt. Okay, so I'm curious about something. I had a conversation with someone in a church a couple of weeks ago who does a lot of strategic work within larger corporations. And the question was, isn't this just strategic planning? I mean, isn't that all we're doing, is bringing in a consultant to do strategic planning for the church? How do you think this is different from strategic planning?
Well, go ahead, Marvin.
So the congregation is encouraged to develop a healthy sense of itself that would exist separate and apart from its settled pastor.
Mm-hmm.
And within corporations, when I worked with IBM, every department was centered upon furthering the IBM identity. And within local churches, what we seek to do as intentional interim clergy is to help that congregation understand that they have an identity that needs to be clearly defined, clearly understood, and affirmed. Then, when the search process begins, they can say to candidates, with regard to a plan of action, we would call it a ministry plan, this is where we want to be 5 years from now. You know, in addition to the educational wing, 50 new members, more young adults. Are you the person who can help us reach that point? And when that is done, the congregation is less likely to be forced to be a chameleon that changes every time a new pastor enters the door. Members of the congregation represent the glue that holds the congregation together. Pastors, and I love this phrase that many of us use, pastors have a tendency to come and go. The congregation, however, remains. And that, I think, distinguishes that setting a bit from a corporate setting where everything is focused upon the brand. We give attention to the brand, but for the purpose of understanding that the future pastor ought to fit into that brand. If they don't, I'm not certain that person should be called as the pastor.
Well, I have thought for years that this process should be used, can be used, particularly by nonprofits, to help them get clear about why they exist. In fact, I led a local Habitat for Humanity just on the mission piece of why they exist. And it was an interesting process, and I enjoyed it. I think the main difference, as far as I can tell, is IBM doesn't talk a great deal about the Holy Spirit and the role, and that's a fundamental difference between strategic planning and intentional interim ministry, is that we're talking about worship. We're talking about the foundations of life, why we exist, and then why we exist as a church. Not the bottom line is far different for a church than it is for IBM. And there are some churches that work like corporations, and my concern for them is that will become their God, so to speak. And they will lose that sense of the holy in their midst because they run like a business. There are parts of the church that are business, should be business-like, but there are some other parts that are far different than business. If we are authentically the church.
Right.
Layne, your comment tends to point to that So the third critical question, who is God calling us to be?
Right.
Some people put the word now on the end of that. Who is God calling us to be? Just one quick example, there was a minister down in, I don't mind saying, the state of Alabama. We did what we call a situational review with that congregation. And the pastor said, happened to be speaking to me, said, Marvin, this church meets our needs just fine, just the way it is. And he said that with such finality. That conversation occurred about 30 years ago. I want you to know today that church does not exist. This church fills our needs just perfectly. In that statement, there was no consideration regarding the church's need to serve the future generation. The interim time gives the congregation an opportunity to consider the future generations and to make decisions that will not only impact their lives, but will impact the next decade. And that was a time when we would talk about corporations may have strategic plans that are 10, 20 years. We live in a world that is changing so rapidly. I tend not to even refer to a 10-year ministry plan anymore, but rather to see to ask the church, where would you like to be 3 years from now? And do you dare comment on where you would like to be 5 years from now? Sharing that with your pastoral candidates will help you to find a person who's willing to buy in to that vision. Having a vision suggests that you're not simply resting on your laurels, but you're thinking about the future. It is an exciting setting to be, time to be with local congregations when they're making these kinds of decisions.
Right.
I went into an interim, went to my first staff meeting, and there were 15 people in the room, and 4 or 5, I didn't have any idea who they were. There were 7 full-time ministers, pastors. The church worshiped at that time, in a typical Sunday morning, was 300 to 350. So very quickly, we had to begin talking about sustainability. And Marvin has, I think, referenced that in terms of looking to the future. How are we going to be sustainable with our mission? Not just to take care of you and me and us. So that's an important question to look to the future. Is what we're doing sustainable? And if not, how can we build sustainability into our work to live out our mission?
Right. It's that reality check, because the mission and the vision are so exciting, but if you don't have the assets to be able to do it and the resources to be able to do it, you're going to have a problem.
Well, and I think it's a fool's errand to say, well, we can do that ourselves. We don't need anybody, a fresh set of eyes. We don't need anybody to ask us. We can ask those questions. And generally, the results leave a lot to be desired.
Absolutely.
So
it's interesting. I love talking with both of you because you're both so good at what you do, but you're very different people. You have different leadership styles, you have different personalities. I'm wondering how you go into a situation with a transition team. How would you define your leadership style, or what's the tone? I'm not sure I'm asking that question very well, but I can imagine Layne entering a room is going to be different than Marvin entering a room. How does that work?
Well, I think Les always told us that you know more about what you're going to do than anybody else in the room. So you've got to act like you know what you're doing, whether you do or not, and figure it out along the way. I think Marvin brought up an important issue, and that's the listening piece. Do we listen? That's how we find out. That's how we do some diagnosis of what's going on, or some potential things that need to be addressed by the congregation. And my job is to work myself out of a job. And so I don't let, and a part of our agreement is always that we will not be a candidate for the installed pastor position. Inevitably, after we've been in a place 3 or 4 weeks and the anxiety level starts to go down, and they see that pretty much most of the time you can walk and chew gum at the same time, somebody will say, well, why don't you just stay and be our pastor? Because that anxiety level's gone down. And my response to that is, well, we have a covenant, and I made a covenant that I wouldn't be. Oh, we can change that covenant. I said, but I gave my word, and you wouldn't want a pastor that wouldn't keep their word, would you? And so, I don't think that answers your question. Maybe a little bit, but Marvin, hop in here.
Well, I do agree that we're blessed in that question comes to us. Let me say, it has come to me in each of 7 congregations for the very reason that Layne has indicated. The anxiety level goes down and people feel as if they want to stay there. And so calling the interim as the pastor would be the solution. But one of the things I want to say in direct response to your question is, when we go through those 5 focus points, I have found it helpful when we get to the 5th focus point of future. And the transition team and I have worked with that congregation through the first 4 focus points, keeping in mind that there is not a hard and fast start and ending point with any of these focus points. One would tend to flow into the other. But when we get ready to move to the future focus point, we invite the leadership body, church council, the board, or other group to proceed to identify persons who will serve on the pastor search committee. We then have the transition team and the pastor search committee to work together as they develop 2 very important documents. Now, I do understand I'm speaking out of a UCC perspective here. One document is a local church profile. That is to say on paper who you are as a church. The other document is a candidate profile, a clearly defined indication of the type of person you're looking for. One very quick example: if you know you want to build an addition onto your education wing, and to do that within the next 3 years, a candidate who applies, who doesn't have a stomach for dealing with another building program, is just reached the end of their rope with that, would know that this is a church where they need not apply. On the other hand, a candidate who has just had a successful experience with the congregation, building a building, adding on to their facilities, for example, might find yours to be an ideal place where they would like to serve. So, and after a period of time, after really about 90 days, the transition team will then, it could be a shorter period, 60 days, they will then take a break, with the exception of a couple of members of the transition team who continue on as part of the search committee. That provides continuity from all that has been learned during the earlier meetings. A part of that continuity is provided for the benefit of the search committee. They then proceed to do their work. Now, once the congregation makes a decision that Pastor Bill is going to be our next pastor, there are some additional transition issues that surface. Who is Pastor Bill? Does Pastor Bill have a family? Does she have needs in the community that we can help identify? That's when some members of the transition team will seek to provide some help enabling that new pastor to transition into that new community. And that is a little piece of the puzzle that many congregations forget. But a family could need a physician for a child during their first week of arrival. Having a list, and there's some suggestions for this in managing transitions with the bridges. Having a list of local physicians, where the local supermarkets are located, those are things that are important. And that's one little distinction. And I think some will wait to have the transition team to complete those documents. I find it helpful to have the search committee engaged in that process.
Yeah, I think that's important. And things are different, obviously, with different denominations.
Yes.
But if I'm in a situation that a congregational, let's say a congregational place, where the congregation or the nominating committee puts together this pastor search team, I train that search team in and give them the tools that they need. They've identified their connections, and so I provide that kind of information because sometimes those connections will help them find their next pastor. But a part of that training and also the transition team training is for each person to have the opportunity to give their faith testimony. Because if you have the right transition team, you may have people that are on different sides of some of these issues, and they need to be human with each other. And once you start sharing your faith and how you became a follower of Jesus, then that begins to help break down some of those barriers to enable real conversation and real work to be accomplished.
Absolutely. It's got to be the trust there. You got to begin that from the beginning. One point of clarification, if you guys don't mind. You're throwing around a couple of terms that may not be familiar: transition team and search committee. Are those the same things? How are they different? And how does that work in the process?
Well, the transition team is the group that facilitates addressing the 5 focus points. Typically, the way I've done that, sometimes I've begun to put that transition team together before I even arrive by sending a letter to the whole church and say, here are the qualifications for somebody, somebody who doesn't have an agenda, somebody that's faithful to the church, someone that is a giver of time, talent, money, somebody that if you had a question about your faith, you might be willing to go talk, those kind of people. Name 5 people that fit that. And then you decide based on the size of the congregation how many you need on the transition team. So how do I get the transition team together? Well, I'll take those names and I'll call church, the head of the chair of the deacons, the chair of church council, maybe the chair of personnel, and say, okay, I've got these names. We need to put together a potential list of transition team members. They'll put together that list and give me some fallback. If somebody says no, then I have another person that I can, it needs to be representative of the congregation. Not that there's a men's group representative, a women's group, but representative of the look of the congregation. Ideally, then I would have an in-person exploration to say, this is what it's going to take for you to serve on the transition team. So I want you, we're having this, let's say Sunday right after worship, we've had sandwich lunch. And I want you to pray about it. And I want you to let me know by Friday if you're willing to serve. And so I get that. And if somebody says, no, it's not for me, I will have an individual meeting with that person that would fill that position. And then we have the retreat. And the retreat is the time when we begin to build a relationship and trust and begin planning how we're going. The first focus point typically is heritage. Let's celebrate what we've done, who we have been. Are there issues that we need to leave in order to move forward? What's so much a part of our DNA that we need to move forward with it? So those are some of the kinds of things that are addressed in heritage. And we begin planning those congregational events to address heritage. That's the transition team. Marvin, why don't you talk about, you can add anything, or you talk about the pastor search.
Thank you. One little nuance that will reveal some denominational approaches to this is that we learn about the stages of the interim time. One of those stages is settling in. I like to arrive on site and use that first 90 days or so, getting to know members of the congregation so that I can then be present when members of the congregation identify folk to serve on that transition team. We tend to show a list of criteria. One of those is no person who's currently serving as an officer in the congregation will be named to the transition team. Why? Because we want to reach deeper into the life of the congregation to draw forth voices that are not always up front and center. I want you to know there is some resistance to that in every setting where I have served, but we've done it. And when those persons come forth, are named, and agree to serve on the transition team, the tendency is that they share leadership skills in ways that were previously unknown. That's one little piece. The other is the United Church of Christ happens to have a national church structure with staff whose specialty is working with the search and call process. That's the term that we use. Therefore, when the search committee and the transition team complete those two major documents, local church profile and a candidate profile, I then let me not say totally, but I back away from the process. I continue to maintain the ministries of the congregation, but a national staff person works with that search committee. That helps us to move one step further from the temptation of saying, I have a good buddy, Layne Smith, over in this state or that state that I'd like you all to think about. We back away from the process and allow the national staff person. Let me say we are required to back away from the process. the national staff person works with that search committee. And they invite the interim pastor in if and only if there's a process question.
Right.
Getting back to that role, Layne, that you mentioned, as we are process facilitators. We are not there to push a candidate for the leadership, future leadership of that congregation. I could say with honesty, we help to define the anticipated character of that candidate because we've helped to develop that clergy profile. But the person, him or herself, is not a decision that we engage in. And we have found that to be helpful.
Absolutely. Typically, a search team will say, well, do you have anybody to recommend?
Sure.
And I will say, if I do, it'll never have my fingerprints on it. You'll get it. You'll never know it came from me. I don't want you considering somebody because I sent their name, or I don't want you not considering somebody because I sent their name. And once I have trained that pastor search team, like Marvin, I back out and I say the only way that I'll help you or attend the meeting is based on if you have questions about the process. I had one interim, they were down to 3 people. And I knew all 3 very well. And I had numerous calls from pastor search team members saying, who should we choose? And I said, I can't recommend anybody. I had a favorite that I wish they had called. They didn't call that person. They called the right person for them. And if it had been up to me, they would have called somebody that I don't think would have been a very good fit. So I think you need to back up. You can talk about qualifications and things to look for in the resume. Is it a real theological education, or is it a mail order? Those kinds of things that help them to read more critically the resume. So.
I gotcha.
And some of the denominations that the Center for Congregational Health is serving have structures that take the guesswork out of that.
Right.
No person can apply to a UCC congregation. I suppose the same is true in the Episcopal Church, unless that person's credentials have already been cleared by the national office. And I do know that that is just a very different matter for Baptist colleagues and congregations who value their local church autonomy in a very, very different way. We've mentioned that one resource, Managing Transitions by William and Susan Bridges. I'd like to add one more, if I may, and that is a book by George Thompson. And any student of mine knows this. A book by George Thompson entitled How to Get Along with Your Church. Subtitle, Building Cultural Capital. And he talks there about the existence of key culture barriers in every congregation. And as I said earlier, it might not be the person who's currently serving in a leadership role, but someone else who has been there and has earned the respect of members of that congregation. George Thompson suggests it's really important to get to know who those persons are so that you're not making big mistakes unnecessarily. And so I wanted to just share that with those who might view this presentation.
That's a great resource. So what I'm hearing from you guys is if we're looking at the process in somewhat of a linear manner, you start out with the transition team, and that's where you're sort of confirming your identity and going through the 5 focus points. And then you've got a separate committee, which would be the search committee. And they're going to be the ones that are handling the search with you just looking at the process. Because I think those terms can be confusing. Sometimes it feels like that should be the same thing. And from what I'm hearing you say, it's often not.
Well, there's a lot of work with the transition team, a lot of work. And I do think, and I agree with Marvin, that one or two from the transition team need to be on the team searching for the new pastor,
Right.
to help explain what the church has been through. And I have recommended that to every church I've served, and only one church failed to put, but once again, I couldn't dictate that. That was their choice. But I think they were poorer for not doing that. Right. And the transition team needs to be a brand new team, not the diaconate or not the church council. It needs to be, because those groups already have work to do.
Amen.
And I agree with Marvin. No elected church leader of groups like that need to be on the transition team, because they typically will have more energy than somebody who's already trying to keep the building up, let's say, or manage the budget.
Exactly.
We have also indicated, I think in almost every setting that I have been in, that the spouse of a church officer could not be on the transition team, because of the periods when that transition team might need to maintain confidentialities for a period of time so that a project might go more successfully. And it's helpful to remember that that search committee will receive some documents. Number one, they will receive a summary report of the interim process, a written summary report. Now, I'm not talking about a dissertation or a thesis. It could be a 5 or 6 page summary of the work that the transition team has done. It will include normally the local church profile and the candidate profile. So that search committee is not beginning from scratch necessarily, but they are benefiting from the work that has just preceded their call as search committee members. And the process, when it goes well, is an amazing process. I know there are many points at which things could go wrong. And we know that when a congregation will extend a call to a second interim because the first one has not worked out. But if we are all engaged in the process in an unanxious manner, the work can get done in a way that benefits a congregation in amazing ways. One person after another, and there are indications of that in the book by William and Susan Bridges, that congregations who have dared to engage the services of an interim have expressed appreciation, overwhelmingly positive appreciation, for having been a part of the process.
One of the other no-nos in terms of membership on the transition team is no staff members.
Oh, yes.
Need to be on that, because some of the conversation around leadership may talk about changing job descriptions, full-time, part-time, and you can't have those conversations with the staff people in the room because you're talking about their livelihood. And that's another reason that the confidentiality piece is so very, very important. Nothing may come of that, but everything has to be on the table in order for healthy decisions to be made.
Exactly.
Yeah. And may I lift up one additional point of anxiety for people. And I'm speaking of anxiety for clergy now. There are times when pastors will sense that they don't want to do interim work because they cannot afford a 3-month or 6-month period of time of unemployment. There are some ways to prepare and to avoid periods of unemployment. There is a sentence in the contracts that I use that says, at the end of the interim time, if I have not yet received a call to a new position, that the congregation will pay 30 days' wages as severance pay. 4 out of 7 congregations have been in a position where they could afford to have that clause present. But 2 or 3 or 4 of those transitions occurred in such a way that as we began to approach the future focus point, I proceeded to circulate my profile, or to allow the national church to circulate it. And I could have done it on my own as well, so that when a congregation decided, just one example, the congregation I currently serve decided that I should be their interim, and they made the decision in the middle of November because they knew that I was planning in the month of January to have the work wrapped up in a previous location. The work in January extended beyond January 15 to January 31st. However, the congregation waited, using the service of a bridge pastor, until I arrived on February 15. So there are ways to avoid long periods of unemployment by paying attention to the clauses in your contract. Now, there were a couple of cases where the clause was there, but I already had a call, and the clause did not cost the congregation one dime. It simply wasn't paid. And I didn't expect it to be paid because I left one position with a start date already scheduled in another position. So we want to urge those who may be thinking or sensing that God is calling you to interim ministry to understand that it can be, especially under today's conditions, as full-time a position as any you might have had in your career. Would you agree to that, Layne?
Yeah, and I think it is helpful if you have a national denomination
Sure.
that will circulate, and some of us don't have that.
Sure.
So it's we're kind of independent. We are independent contractors and have to go out and find our own work.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about anxiety. It just brought to mind something that I tell every congregation when they start showing their anxiety. Well, you know, wasn't God faithful to the Hebrew children for 40 years in the wilderness? If God was faithful for 40 years to them, do you think God might be faithful to you for 18 months? And sometimes that helps a little bit of that anxiety to dissipate.
Yes. That's actually a great segue. Thinking about anxiety for the potential intentional interim, and the anxiety for the church as well. One of the things that I'd love to do before we leave, and we can come back to some more things in the next webinar, put in a little bit of a plug for the Center for Congregational Health and just who I am and what happens. The Center for Congregational Health is part of the Faith Health Department of Atrium. We're 30 years old this year, and we have intentional interim services in addition to consulting and coaching services. But we've trained almost 3,000 people over the last 30 years, which is pretty amazing. And we maintain a database of people who have come through the training, who have had good recommendations from other churches, because we have a review process at the end. And if you call the center, you can talk to me, talk to someone else that can give you some more information about the process and some more of the nuts and bolts of everything. And then we can sort of do a bit of a matchmaking type of service, put you in touch with some people that might be available, and then you as a church can go through and interview them. So, and hopefully you can find someone as wonderful as Marvin and Layne, because there are a lot of good people in there. But anyway, I want to thank you guys for this conversation. It's been really rich and really wonderful, and we'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. Take care. Bye-bye.